everyone. This is a quick video to talk to you about what a meter reading is and also how your camera can basically tell you whether or not there's enough light in your image. We're also going to talk briefly about how to change the ISO setting on your particular camera. So let's get started. The camera actually has a built-in meter that can tell you what your exposure will look like before you actually take the image. So if you turn your camera on and you point the lens at a scene that you want to capture, it will take a meter reading. Now to do this, your camera has to be in one of the manual exposure modes. Those modes are M for manual, TV for time value or shutter speed priority, AV for aperture value or aperture priority, or program. Program mode is actually part auto, part manual, but it will show you a meter reading if you use that. So it's going to tell you how much light is in your image. Is there enough light that's being let in for a proper exposure? Is there too much light, so you'll see an overexposure? Or is there not enough light and you'll get an underexposure given the settings that you're using? So let's look at what an image that is overexposed, underexposed, and properly exposed. Let's have a look at what those images look like. So here we have three different images. They're all of the same subject. It's a barn in Montana with a little bit of a mountain range shown behind it. The image in the center is properly exposed. That means that there's enough light in the image to show the viewer of the photograph just what the light looked like on scene. It's properly exposed. The image in the lower left-hand corner is much brighter than the center image, right? So that's considered an overexposure. There's too much light being let into the camera, and you end up with a very bright image that's not showing the colors or the exposure appropriately, and it's considered an overexposure. The image in the lower right-hand corner is an underexposure. The opposite is happening. Not enough light was let into the camera, and so you're getting an underexposure. So this is the meter reading that your particular camera can show you. So in this shot, we've set the camera to manual mode, and this little scale at the bottom right-hand corner of the image is a meter reading. So your camera is taking an exposure reading, and it's saying, okay, you've set the ISO to 100, you're using an f8 for an aperture, and you've got 1/6 of a second for a shutter speed, and you're not using the flash. You can tell that we're not using the flash mainly because the little flash for your camera, the internal flash, has not popped up on the top of the camera, and also you see that little flash arrow with an X through it right underneath the M that's showing us that we're not using the flash. So given all of these exposure controls, your camera is telling you this image is slightly overexposed. If you see that white dot on the right hand side of the meter, it's about one tick above perfectly center. Now if that tick was perfectly center, right in the center of that meter, then this would be considered a proper exposure. So with these settings, we're close. We're almost at the perfect exposure, but we're one tick above it. In this image, what's happened? Well, we left the ISO the same, we left the aperture the same, but we changed our shutter speed. In the image before, remember, we were at 1/6 of a second, which is actually pretty long, too long to hold without a flash for shutter speed. And we changed this shutter speed to 1/250th of a second, much, much faster. So we're letting less light in. And that's exactly what our meter reading is telling us. If you look at that little orange dot on the bottom of the meter scale there, it's telling you it's drastically underexposed. And you can also see that on the LCD screen. If you look at the preview of this image on your LCD screen, it's almost black, right? You can't make out anything in the room. So our meter reading and the image on our LCD screen is telling us that this is an underexposure. The opposite is being shown in this image. We left the ISO the same, we left the aperture the same, but what do we do to the shutter speed? We changed the shutter speed to 2 full seconds, which, as you guys now know, is a very long time in photography. And that orange dot has gone all the way up to the top of the meter. That's telling us that this image is overexposed. There's too much light. So if we took this image just the way it was, and you look at the little LCD screen here, everything is basically white and blown out. This will give us an overexposure. So this little meter at the bottom of your camera can actually help guide you as to which exposure controls you should be changing, which exposure controls, what your exposure controls need to be set at. So use this meter reading to help you when you're in one of the manual modes to figure out if your exposure is going to be correct. Now I just want to take a very short amount of time to show you guys how to set the ISO setting on your camera. You need to be in one of the manual modes again. If you're shooting in auto mode, your camera is going to select your ISO for you and it won't give you this option. But if you're in one of the manual modes like we discussed earlier, you can change your ISO setting. All you have to do is push on the little wheel basically right above the function set, not the function set button, but the wheel just above it where it says ISO, and this is the screen that it will show you. You can set your ISO to auto, meaning that the camera will select it for you, or you can use any of the settings on here. 100 is obviously a very low setting, so you would use that if there's a lot of light in your scene and you don't need your camera to be super sensitive, and then you can move up from there. That's how you set your camera's ISO setting.